Okay, I think we're recording now. So let's go ahead and just get into defining our variables, and then we'll go from there. So when we talk about stereotypes, stereotypes, as it just says, is a generalized belief about a group of people, often oversimplifying it, simplified, and can be inaccurate on a lot of levels. Now, why do we have this tendency to stereotype? And it has to deal with our complex world that we live in and that we're constantly interpreting. Okay. I want you to imagine if you were to walk into a room of 100 people and you had to look at each of those individuals individually and analyze each individual for their own unique qualities and stuff to make a decision on who you're going to go sit with, who you're going to interact with, and the like. It probably would be very, very overwhelming. So, stereotypes allow us to go into a room, and the first stereotypes we divide people are on our gender. So, what is a typical female, male? Then, usually, it's race. Mexican American, Tana Otham, white European, all of those divisions. And then age is the next category that we then stereotype on. And then based upon that, we navigate towards the individuals that we are most comfortable with. Okay. The issues with stereotypes, while they do help us guide our world and make it so we can simplify life and the way things are, is a lot of times these stereotypes can be oversimplified. So if you see in this, for example, we have this Latina cartoon figure, and often exotic, spicy. I would exotic are often things associated with this type of persona or this type of individual, which may be, as implicated right here, may be totally off base and may be totally and completely wrong. Okay. And so when we look at stereotypes, the way to understand these set the ground um, rules, the cognitive kind of belief systems that then give a way to prejudice and discrimination. Okay. And so when we look at then prejudice and discrimination, we find that prejudice can be defined as a negative attitude towards a group based on stereotypes and emotional reactions. So when we think about, again, going back to here, stereotypes is a general belief system. So this is a belief that we have about a group. Okay. So it's a cognitive aspect of how we're evaluating our world. Our prejudice are our attitudes, usually negative, about a given group. And they're based upon stereotypes, which again is that cognitive grouping of a given group, and our emotional reaction, emotional reactions, excuse me. So a prejudice is a combination of our stereotypes and how we emotionally or visceral reaction when we're around a certain group. Okay. And it's important to recognize that prejudices can be conscious and unconscious. Okay. Um, and some examples of this, and the difficult part about prejudice, especially when it comes to culturally based prejudices, such as prejudice against race and gender and religion or disability, even when they're culturally based, they often can come out unconsciously. Okay. And I may have done this in this class already, but I detailed what were known as the Shelley studies in the 1980s and 1990s that kind of show this aspect of prejudice. And just in case I am just rehearsing it for the class, I want to go through it again, is growing amount of research suggests that prejudices have an ingrained aspect, meaning that we all have prejudices, and that we have to make a conscious choice not to act on those prejudices. Okay. And an example of this comes out in what were known as the Shelley studies. In the Shelley studies, we measured people's level of prejudice towards a different racial group. Okay. And of course, there were people who were high in prejudice, and there were people in low in prejudice. Okay. What they did in these studies, though, is they asked both groups to either act prejudiced or unprejudiced. And you probably, I'm not surprised that a highly prejudiced person can act unprejudiced, and a highly unprejudiced person can act prejudiced. Okay, and that's kind of the no duh part of this study. What was interesting is in the next aspect of the study, where they had the individuals go down a hallway and grab something and bring it back. Okay. In the interaction on their return, there was going to be someone of a different race who was going to need help. So they, in most cases, they drop some papers in front of the person, which would either engage helping behavior or unhelping behavior. Okay. And sure enough, but there were two experimental groups. One group, the people just went down and back. In the second group, the individuals walked back and forth, but they had to count in 100s in 7, 4s, and 2s. So they'd have to go 100, 93, 89, 87, 80, and count backwards doing that while they were going back and forth. Okay. Well, when the people were freely able to walk back and forth without being what we call cognitively tasked, the non-prejudiced people would stop and help, and the prejudiced people would act prejudiced. They'd make snide remarks. They would make culturally definable negative remarks. And so it was very aligned with their conscious prejudices, okay, or non-prejudices. But when they were tasked, and this is just a simple example of what they did to kind of show this is just part of it. When they were tasked, both the prejudiced group and the non-prejudiced group acted prejudice. They both said derogatory things towards the individual. They both did not engage in helping. They both engaged in what you would consider discriminatory behavior. Okay, and this is where the unconscious components of prejudice come from. Is that we do hold prejudices within us, especially culturally based prejudices, that when we don't have the ability to think about our behavior, to think about the way we want to act, those unconscious prejudices can come out. Okay. So that's kind of the notion on prejudice. And of course, we can see all kinds that we'll get into throughout this course or throughout these lectures. Okay. Now let's define discrimination. Okay. Discrimination is the behavior. Okay. So if we think about it, the stereotypes with an S are our cognitive evaluation. Our prejudices are our attitudes. Discrimination is our behavior towards another group. So in the previous example I gave with the Shelley studies, the prejudice came out in their attitude, the derogatory statements they make, the facial expressions they would make. Their discriminatory behaviors came out in either doing the helping behavior or non-helping behavior. Okay, so that's kind of the examples and the differences between each type of these things. And you'll notice that each one relies on the other one. One, we have a cognitive belief, and then we have an affective or emotional experience with our attitudes. And then that results in some type of behavior that we commit, which is then what we call discrimination. Okay. And again, here in a little while, we'll get to different levels of discrimination, because there can be what we call systematic discrimination, where certain groups aren't allowed the same benefits as other groups. And there can be the individual levels of discrimination that is committed just by individuals within their cultural context. Okay. So again, if we want to kind of give a visual of all three, our stereotypes are those thoughts about people. Okay. Prejudices is our feelings towards others. And discrimination is our behaviors towards others that are not like us. Okay. And again, the connection is that the stereotypes are these overgeneralized beliefs that an outgroup are all the same. So in this example, the Yankees are arrogant and obnoxious. Prejudice is feeling may influence the treatment. I hate the Yankees fans. They make me angry. Okay. And then discrimination is I would never hire nor become a friend with a person I knew he or she were a Yankees fan. Then that's the behavior aspect of it. Okay. So let's look at some of the research, kind of the historical aspects of understanding each one of these. So psychological research on stereotypes, the early studies conceptualize stereotypes as these mental shortcuts we take in order to navigate, again, our social complex world. Okay. And later on in these lectures, we're going to talk about two systems of evaluating social information. And we're going to call them actually System 1 and System 2. System 1 is our automatic system. It is that thing that provides us instantaneous information about another group or another individual that is presented to us. System 2 is when we make a deliberate effort to understand another individual or another person or another group. So it is the slower, more arduous system. Okay. And you could guess as a species, and this deals with things like survival, and we could get into why we do this. I should put E for effortful analysis. We navigate our world mostly through automatic processing. Okay. There's a saying that says human beings are cognitively lazy, and we would prefer just to use this rapid system to navigate the world than to really sit down and put the deliberate effort, the exhausting effort to look at individuals and who they are and what they're about. Okay. And so we'll talk more later on about the System 1 and System 2 of evaluating social groups and social information. Okay. Current research, so the earlier research kind of went with this kind of showing that these are really mental shortcuts that we take in evaluating different groups and different people. Current research has focused on the difference between explicit stereotypes and implicit stereotypes. Okay. And this kind of goes back to that conscious, unconscious aspects of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Okay. Is that implicit stereotypes are those stereotypes that we hold that we may not be totally consciously aware of. Okay. And these can impact decision making. So in another area of research, we have what's called implicit versus explicit attitudes. Okay. And this is very similar to this idea, and we'll get more detailed about this in a little while. But what we have found is that our implicit attitudes tend to drive our behavior more predictably than our explicit attitudes. Okay. And we do this for various reasons, such as we may hold a negative explicit attitude, but because of the social situation and social representation, we don't act on that explicit stereotype or that explicit attitude. Okay. So there's a whole realm of different things that influence whether or not we will act on an explicit stereotype or attitude. However, these implicit ones tend to drive us from the unconscious area, and they tend to be more on the automatic level because we're not aware of them. Okay, so these are some kind of the areas of stereotypes that we look at. And when we look at, for example, prejudice, okay, um, and we talk about prejudices between groups and whatnot, we look at really Allport's original research, because this is going to be the beginning of how can we get different peoples of different races and ethnicities to come together and be kind with each other or reduce prejudices. And he came up with what's known as the contact hypothesis. Okay. The contact hypothesis is kind of based on research in the classroom. Okay. Where we find that at the beginning of a semester, for example, if I were to have you write down on a scale of 1 to 10 your favorability of each of the other members in the classroom, okay, and then I had you repeat this at the end of the semester, okay, for those who you rated less favorably, regardless of the amount of contact you'd have with them during the course of the semester, those who you rated less favorably, you would rate more favorably at the end of the semester. Okay. Suggesting that purely having contact between intergroups can reduce prejudice. Now, this and those classroom studies were the basis of integration here in the United States, where segregation was ended and schools had to be integrated. And the belief at the time was just purely having those mixed children together would reduce that prejudice. And as we will see, while contact hypothesis is really important, to truly reduce prejudices, there has to be other variables at play. And we'll get into those a little bit later in the course about how do we just beyond just simple contact, how do we really reduce things like prejudice, okay? Contemporary studies examine implicit bias and its influences on behavior, again, going with that trend that we saw with stereotypes. So how do our implicit biases we have about other people drive our attitude or belief about those individuals or those different groups? And we'll get into, again, a little bit more of that here in a bit, okay? What about research on discrimination? Again, we talked about social identity theory. We're going to kind of nail it down a little bit more here. But basically in its most basic thing is individuals favor in-group over out-groups, okay? And based upon this, then we also today have a huge focus on systematic discrimination in various social institutions. So the idea is that's currently being formulated in the idea of discrimination is uh, we could use the analogy of an apple barrel. Okay. If you have one bad apple, that will start to affect all the other apples in the group. But in order for that to happen, there has to be a barrel. Okay. And locked within that barrel, then that starts to rot the other apples in that thing. But what we understand, so that's social identity. That's our groups we belong to, our in groups. Okay. And our belief systems then can become slighted based on different attitudes or what we would call bad apples within that barrel. Okay. But the problem is it's usually the apples that are closest to the edge of the barrel that rot first. And in current research, what we want to know is who are the bad barrel makers? What is the systems that create the barrels that apples rot in? Okay. So this is the governments, the systems, the policies, the procedures, the way things are established that can create various types of discrimination through our social institutions. Okay. And you can kind of, if you're following current politics right now, you can kind of see some of these kind of systematic discriminations with the ending of the DEI programs and what's happening with the transgender and the military right now, and all those kind of different areas of systematic ways of making sure that groups that don't belong to us from a party political perspective are then taken out of the system and taken out of the benefits that come with being part of the American system. Okay, so that's an example of what we would call systematic discrimination. Okay, so I do want to detail more just for a little while about social identity theory. Okay, again, it was developed to explain a sense of self through group membership, as we highlighted and as you saw in your assignment. And what SIT suggests is people categorize themselves and others into in groups, those they belong to, and out groups, those they do not belong to. Okay. And then this leads, as we talked about a little bit the other day, leads to comparisons that influence self-esteem and our social behaviors. Okay. And again, there's three processes, key psychological processes when it comes to social identity. One is social categorization, classifying people into groups. Social identification, excuse me, adopting group identity as part of your self-concept. And then the third process is social comparison, evaluating one's group relative to others. Okay. So these are the three processes that, if you think about it, develop the stereotypes, the prejudices, and the discriminations that can form. Okay. So again, it is important to recognize why we develop social identities. Okay. One, we know it promotes in-group solidarity and cooperation. So this can be very helpful in an organizational or a classroom setting, or trying to solve some issue. It strengthens teamwork, stronger organizational commitment. It enhances self-esteem and well-being, as we talked about last week with the health and mental health benefits of having a strong social identity. And we know that having a strong identity among individuals who are even within marginalized groups can strengthen their mental health and strengthen their physical health as well. Okay. And encourages collective action for social change, as shared group identity can mobilize and collect efforts to challenge things like inequality and discrimination. So we could look at things, for example, like the transgender movement, the LGBTQ movement, the efforts made by Native American tribes coming together in consortiums to try and influence governmental policy. Okay. Social movements, again, such as civil rights activism, gender equality campaigns, are often driven by a strong sense of identity with a group that has a common cause. Okay. So all of these can make good social movement and create a sense of wellness and well-being. Okay. But again, as I explained last week, these also have the negative consequences, okay, such as intergroup bias and discrimination, because we have that in-group favoritism, okay. It develops our stereotypes and group conflicts that we will get to a bias here in a little while that suggests that we see more differences within our in groups and more similarities with out groups, meaning people in an out group are not different from each other. What makes my in group unique is that we're all different and we all have different ideas and different perspectives that come together to create better decisions than what those individuals who all think the same do. Okay. And so you can guess that this creates a lot of stereotyping and group conflict. Okay. And of course, there's always risk of some identity becoming radicalized or extremist in some form. So we could think of, for example, white males is a category, right? White European is a category, but then there's the extreme white racists in the world who believe that they are the ultimate race, and that any other race should either be to service of this group or should be pushed out of the social group or society in some way. Okay, so we can see that there's based on these group categorizations and these identities that it can create aspects of kind of the negative aspects of identity. Okay. And so like I said earlier, I wanted to kind of get into this implicit versus explicit biases just a little bit more detail. Okay. So as I mentioned, implicit biases are unconscious and automatic, while explicit are those decisions biases we have that are very conscious and very deliberate. Okay. The way implicit biases are measured, and we will actually have an assignment dealing with implicit attitude tests. Probably we'll start it next week. Is that it looks at basically reaction time. Okay. And so you have your hand out on two keys usually. Okay. And what happens in the most basic example is it shows a image of someone like you or someone unlike you. So again, when I look at here in the United States, if it's a white European, the person that would be most opposite of them in this culture is, of course, a Black American, right? And so it will show an image of a Black person or a white person. And then it would either put an image, a positive image or a negative image next to it, okay? Or it might put a positive word or negative word to it. And what they're looking for is your reaction time, because what it asks is, do these two things match with each other? So you can imagine, if you're a white person taking one of these tests, and you see a picture of another white person and it says intelligent, okay, you're probably going to react to that very quickly. Okay. But then let's say there's a image of a black person, and the word with it is intelligent. Okay. The idea is if you hold an implicit attitude, you're now coming to a conflict, a mental conflict. So that's going to slow down your reaction time. Okay. And then, if you can kind of guess this, if it comes up with a white picture of a white person and it says angry, there again creates a conflict. Okay. And then it comes up with a black person and it says angry. There's no conflict if they have implicit biases. Okay. So they'll react quicker. Okay. So what the implicit attitude test does is it measures reaction time, and it presents either images that are easily associated with each other or that might conflict with each other, dependent upon the person who is taking the IAT test. Okay. And based on that, we actually have found that implicit biases do drive quite a bit of our behaviors and how we act towards other people. Again, if we don't have the conscious ability to think about how we should be acting within a given situation. Okay. And this is why, in times of stress and times of, you could probably feel this on a national level, it feels like there's more negative attitudes towards groups of people when things are stressed. So when we go through, for example, a recession, or there's this job market issue, or there's these things that are happening on a cultural level, you will notice that there's an association between prejudices and how a person is feeling economically, socially, and the like. Okay. And so this is something to think about as we move through understanding these on cultural levels. Okay. When we look at brain imaging, we do see stereotypes indicate that stereotypes actually activate on the amygdala level, which then gives us our prejudice response, our effective response to that stereotype. So I'm not sure if I've explained in this class, the amygdala is the emotional area of the brain, but its most basic reaction is to the emotion of fear. Okay. And so when you're looking at these stereotypes and you're looking at someone who is different than you, and those automatic stereotypes kick in that can be negative, then that's going to turn on that fear area of the amygdala, which is then going to maybe result in a prejudice belief and potentially then a discriminatory behavior. Okay. So that's kind of how we've made sense of the association between these cognitive stereotypes and emotional or visceral reactions. And of course, the impact of stereotypes, it influences our perceptions, our behaviors, our performance. One example of this is when I was an undergraduate. Oh, I wonder if I have that image somewhere. It was a perceptual kind of tasks where we activated different stereotypes. Okay. And basically, oh, I wonder if I have that. Let me look for it really quick because it's kind of interesting. Let me see if I can find it. All right, here it is. All right, this image here, if you want to take a look at it, basically, if you look at this image, you basically have some individuals sitting around a fire, doing what people around a fire do or whatnot. But I want to rewind kind of this narrative. Is in this research, what we did is we did a priming activity, and then in a totally different type of situation, we saw if that priming would activate stereotypes in the impression of an image. Okay. And so what we did in the first part of the research is we were just saying, we just did a bogus kind of thing that doing some mental task like reading influences a person's physical abilities. Okay. So in that research, we either had them write, read a story about inner city life. Okay. There were no pictures, nothing, just about what it's like to live in inner cities. Okay. And then another group read stories about the being in the open rural places and wilderness. Okay. And then we did this bogus thing where we had them go walk or jog around a track, and we measured their time it took them to circle a track. Really, that was the bogus part of the research. That was kind of the manipulation, part of the manipulation. But what after that, what we did is we said, hey, if you just have a few more minutes, can you participate in this other research that we're doing on perception? Okay. And in that research, what we did is we presented this image for 1 second and 1 second only. So this is how quick stereotypes can form. Okay. And then we had them write down everything that they saw in that picture. All right. And what was interesting is priming the stereotype of either inner city or the great outdoors had an effect on what people wrote down about what they saw in this image. So, individuals who an hour or so earlier read something about living in the inner city, this was most of these individuals. You'll notice this guy, I think, is kind of white. And there was one of those fire barrels that you see in inner cities where all the unhoused individuals are, and they're all surrounded that. This dog was never seen. They were all wearing hoodies. They were all black. And I think this guy they thought maybe was holding a pistol, but if you see right down here in this corner, this guy was definitely holding a gun in a lot of the reports. Okay. Versus the people who read the story about the great outdoors, they actually got this one a little bit more accurate. They saw the fire. These guys weren't all wearing hoodies. He was actually holding a cup. They recognized the dog. They also recognized the more friendly gesture that this guy is. I think he's petting the dog, and they gave a more accurate view of what we see right here. Okay. And the point of this is that one, they had an activation of a stereotype earlier that then was gone from their awareness. Okay. They weren't aware that we activated a stereotype earlier in the day. Okay. But two, it only took 1 second for that activated stereotype then to put an impression on what the individual thought that they saw. Okay. So this is an example of stereotype and activation of stereotypes. Okay. So now going back to here, So this is why we say that stereotypes can have such an influence on our behaviors without us even being aware that they are. They can bias our perceptions. We can even see people differently than how they're actually appearing to us. And they can really kind of bias our perspective. Okay. Another aspect of stereotypes, though, is a line of research that has started pretty recently called stereotype threat. Okay, and I want to kind of detail what stereotype threat is. Okay, a stereotype threat occurs when an individual from a stereotype group experiences anxiety about needing to confirm a negative stereotype which can impact their performance in academics and professional settings. Okay. And just some of the first key findings, one of the first key findings is that we found that Black students performed worse on tests when they was framed as measuring intelligence and performed equally well when it was not. Okay, and so there's two lines of research that I want to kind of influence right here. Okay, um, so in one of the research, it was just you're going to take this test, okay, and it was a cognitive test, just measuring cognitive ability, problem solving ability, and whatnot. And for these Black students, they were told that it measures their intelligence, okay, and as you know, one of the stereotypes, one of the generalized stereotypes of Black individuals is that they tend to be less intelligent than their white counterparts. Okay, now I'm not saying that's fact, please. It's not, because when we don't say that it's a measure of intelligence, we found that these Black students measured equally well. Okay, that was the start of this idea of stereotype threat. And then the research went a little bit further. They took some inner city Black community college students on two separate Saturdays to the Stanford campus. Okay. For one group of Black students from the inner city, when they arrived to the Stanford campus, and this is why they chose Saturday, because the campus was empty. When they were going in to do this cognitive test, there were some white students just outside the door. Now, these white students didn't say anything. They didn't do any derogatory stares or anything. Okay, and then the students went in and they took the test. Okay, on the second Saturday, for the second group, there were no white students around. Okay, in both cases, the person administering the test was Black. Okay, now if I were to graph this out, okay, and as a control, of course, they gave the Stanford students the cognitive test, which you would guess from Ivy League schools, they scored really high. Okay. But what was interesting was the difference between Saturday 1 and Saturday 2. Remember, Saturday 1, there were white students just sitting outside of the building. Okay. In that case, they scored what the stereotype of these individuals would be. They scored really low. Okay. What was interesting was on Saturday 2. On Saturday 2, when there was no stereotypes being ignited because there wasn't the negative stereotyping group there, these individuals actually scored just as high as the Stanford students. There was no difference between the two groups. Okay. And this became kind of more of the behavioral aspect that would not only can you tell someone a negative stereotype, such as this test is a measure of intelligence versus not, but just having the presence of a stereotype threat can also influence the performance of individuals. Okay. This research suggests that stereotype threats undermine confidence and increases stress and reduces working memory, which is what those cognitive tests really measured in the Stanford was working memory. Okay. So this is an example of stereotype threat. Other research, we've looked at women in the STEM field may underperform due to this stereotype threat. Workplace stereotype threats affect decision making and leadership participation. So what are some ways that we can reduce stereotype threat? And one is reframing tasks to minimize stereotype activation. You encourage what's called a growth mindset and self-affirmation, and in promoting inclusive environments to reduce identity-based stresses. And these are all things that we should really kind of think about as we move through our different worlds that we exist in, right? Kind of on an interesting area of that deals with stereotype threat is college success, and I think this is kind of a good place to end in this example of research. Is again, we can either take first generational students where the family didn't have a belief in education, marginalized groups such as Black first generational students, even Mexican American students, and the like. And what they did in this research, and it's really fascinating, is they read a success story from someone from their group, so if it was a Black student, it was a success story of a Black graduate, okay? If it was a first generational student, it was a story from a first generational student. And that, just reading that story, which is really kind of interesting, had a positive effect on students' GPA clear through their senior year. Students who read just stories that were not about them, didn't have anything to do with who they were, their GPAs were lower than students who read success stories about them and who they come from. Okay. And it's interesting because that was just like an hour activity at the beginning of starting a person's college career. And it had a positive effect on GPA all the way through the 4 years of college university that the students went through. So there's even small manipulations or small things that we could be put in place that can reduce these stereotype threats. All right, gang, I want to kind of end where we'll pick up on next Wednesday is reducing prejudice, and then we'll get into more than just the contact hypotheses about what are some strategies that we have found that really can reduce or have an effect on people's prejudices as well. So I'm going to stop sharing right here.